The corridors of Celestial Crossing absorbed sound like a hungry thing, making even crowded passages feel isolated. Lieutenant Tobias Grant had stopped finding it unsettling after month 3. Now, 8 months into what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic rotation, the silence felt appropriate. Everything about this station existed in careful, controlled quiet. He navigated the diplomatic wing with practiced efficiency, nodding to a Tholian trade negotiator whose methane suit hissed softly as they passed, stepping aside for a group of Andorian cultural attachés who moved in tight formation like schooling fish. The station housed 17 different species, all theoretically working toward greater galactic cooperation, all actually maneuvering for advantage in ways that made Tobias's head hurt. But the Velkari were different. They didn't maneuver. They simply existed at the top of every hierarchy, and everyone else adjusted accordingly. Tobias had seen Princess Andrast Velkathara exactly 47 times. He'd counted, though he wouldn't admit that to anyone. She attended key negotiation sessions, always accompanied by at least 3 attendants, always wearing formal diplomatic attire that seemed to shift colors based on lighting or mood or factors he didn't understand. Her ears were longer and more expressive than humans, capable of rotating to track sounds from multiple directions simultaneously. Her skin held a base tone of pale silver that overlaid with subtle color shifts, a chromatic language that human eyes could barely perceive, let alone interpret. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost hostile, like looking at a sculpture in a museum that reminded you that you were ordinary and temporary, while it was extraordinary and eternal. And she had never once looked directly at him. The briefings had been explicit. Do not approach Princess Andrast unless summoned. Do not speak to her directly unless she addresses you first. Do not attempt informal contact of any kind. The warnings came from both Velkari protocol officers, delivered with the kind of condescension that suggested they were explaining fire safety to children, and from Human Command, who emphasized that the princess viewed humanity as culturally primitive and biologically inferior. She considers us evolutionary embarrassments, Colonel Reeves had said during Tobias's initial orientation. So we smile, we bow when appropriate, and we stay the hell out of her way unless protocol demands otherwise. Tobias had followed those instructions perfectly for 8 months. Today's negotiation session was particularly brutal. The topic was mining rights in the Kael'thas sector, and the Velkari position was that humanity's 3-decade presence there was recent and ultimately provisional, compared to their own historical claims dating back 8 centuries. "We maintain navigational markers throughout Kael'thas," said Elder Morvain, his skin flashing authoritative purple. "Our claim is established by precedent and presence." Ambassador Wei Lin, head of the human delegation, responded with diplomatic precision. "Navigational markers do not constitute colonial claim under Galactic Assembly law. Humanity has established active settlements on 4 worlds in that sector. Settlements that would not exist without our navigational infrastructure. Infrastructure you established but never utilized for colonization." The argument cycled through variations of the same positions for 3 hours. Tobias translated cultural nuances and provided historical context when requested, but mostly he watched the dance of diplomatic language that meant everything and resolved nothing. Princess Andrast sat at the center of the Velkari delegation, her expression perfectly neutral, her skin maintaining steady silver. She spoke only once during the entire session, and it was to end it. "This discussion has reached its productive limit. We adjourn until next week." 3 words from her carried more weight than 3 hours of debate from everyone else. As delegates filed out, Tobias lingered to shut down the translation matrix and secure the session records. Standard procedure, and it gave him a few minutes of silence before returning to the endless queue of diplomatic correspondence waiting in his quarters. He was nearly finished when he heard Ambassador Wei's voice in the corridor outside, speaking to someone in formal Velkari. "Your Highness, we appreciate your patience with today's discussions. Patience is infinite when progress is absent. Princess Andrast's voice carried harmonics that the translation software usually flattened. Hearing it directly was like discovering that a familiar painting had colors you'd never noticed. Perhaps next week will prove more productive. Perhaps. Their footsteps faded. Tobias exhaled slowly, finished securing the records, and escaped to the one place on the station where he could temporarily stop being Lieutenant Grant, military liaison, representative of humanity's best diplomatic face. The observation deck occupied the station's upper ring, featuring a massive transparent dome that offered unobstructed views of the surrounding nebula. At this hour, 2347 station time, it was almost always empty. Most species kept to their own circadian rhythms, and humans were one of the few that found night, on a space station, meaningful enough to seek out dark, quiet places. Tobias settled into his usual corner seat, a position that offered the best view of the nebula's core, where stellar nurseries painted everything in shades of violet and crimson. He pulled up his personal data pad, not the official one loaded with diplomatic files, but his own device carrying messages from home, music he actually enjoyed, and research projects that had nothing to do with his current assignment. He'd been reading about Earth's ancient navigation practices, how humans had crossed oceans using only stars and dead reckoning, when he heard footsteps behind him. Soft, deliberate, moving with the kind of silence that suggested someone who didn't want to be noticed, but also wasn't trying to hide. Tobias looked up and forgot how to breathe. Princess Andrast Velkithara stood at the entrance to the observation deck, looking directly at him. Her formal attire was gone, replaced by something simpler, a long tunic in deep blue that made her skin's silver tone more pronounced. Her attendants were notably, impossibly absent. They stared at each other for a moment that stretched into something uncomfortable. Every protocol briefing screamed at him to leave, to apologize for intruding on her privacy, to bow and retreat and pretend this encounter never happened. Instead, he stood slowly, keeping his movements non-threatening, and said, "Your Highness, I was just leaving." "Were you?" "Ah, yes. That is unfortunate." She moved forward, her steps silent on the observation deck's sound-absorbing floor. "I was hoping for company." Tobias's brain provided several responses simultaneously. "This is a trap. This violates protocol. This can't possibly be real, and you're about to get court-martialed." What came out was, "You want company." I would not have said so otherwise. She crossed the deck and sat in the chair beside his, not across the space maintaining formal distance, but right beside him, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns in her skin that shifted with light and motion. Tobias sat down slowly, his military training warring with complete confusion about what exactly was happening. They sat in silence. The nebula wheeled slowly beyond the dome. Stellar gases painted the darkness with colors that had nothing to do with human or Velkari vision. These were wavelengths neither species had evolved to see, now visible through technology that democratized the universe's beauty. Andras didn't speak, neither did Tobias. The silence stretched from uncomfortable to neutral to something approaching comfortable. He risked a glance at her, found her staring at the stars with an expression that might have been wonder or sadness or something human faces didn't make. Her ears twitched slightly when a particularly bright star rotated into view, a pulsar probably, its rotation making it flash like a cosmic lighthouse. Her breathing was slower than human standard, deeper, with a rhythm that reminded him of meditation techniques. And she'd chosen to sit on his right side, where his hearing was better after a shuttle accident had damaged his left ear. Coincidence? Or had she noticed somehow? After what felt like 30 minutes but might have been 10, she spoke. Not in formal Velkari with its layers of meaning and chromatic reinforcement. Not through the translation matrix that turned everything into bland diplomatic standard, but in carefully pronounced, slightly accented human speech. "The stars look different from here than from my homeworld." Her voice without translation was remarkable, carrying overtones and harmonics that suggested music more than speech, like someone had figured out how to make language itself sing. Tobias found his voice, different how. Velkara Prime sits in the galactic arm's inner spiral. From there, the stellar density is such that darkness never truly exists. Always there is light from some star, some cluster, some nebula. We do not have what you call night. That sounds beautiful. It is, but it means we do not see what you see, the true vastness of space, the empty distances between lights. She tilted her head slightly. Here I can see the darkness. It is both frightening and clarifying. Tobias nodded slowly. I grew up on a colony world called New Hebrides. Earth's constellations meant nothing there. The stars were completely different. I had to learn navigation by markers that weren't in any Earth mythology. Navigation by your own discoveries, rather than inherited knowledge. Exactly. It felt like we were writing our own mythology instead of copying someone else's. And yet you were still human, still connected to Earth even across impossible distances. Yeah, home is weird like that. You can leave it, but it doesn't really leave you. She made a sound that might have been agreement. I have been away from Velkara for 14 months. I dream sometimes that when I return, no one will remember me, that I will have become strange to them. Do you miss it, your homeworld? Every day. And yet I am needed here, performing this function, representing my people, ensuring that their interests are protected. Her skin shifted to something grayish-blue that looked like melancholy. Sometimes I think I am most useful when I am furthest from what I love. The honesty in that statement hit Tobias like a physical thing. This wasn't diplomatic speech. This was genuine feeling, offered without calculation. I know that feeling, he said quietly. I joined diplomatic service after my brother died in the border skirmishes. Thought maybe I could prevent other families from losing someone. But the work it's necessary, but it's also endless. And sometimes I wonder if anything I do actually matters. It matters. She turned to look at him directly, and he saw that her eyes weren't uniformly silver but held flecks of color that shifted like opals. I have watched you these past months. You are careful with other species' customs. You stay late reviewing protocols. You correct translation errors that others miss. These are not the actions of someone who believes their work is meaningless. He felt his face warm, embarrassed by the observation and the attention it implied. You've been watching me. I observe everyone, it is habit and necessity. She paused, but yes, I have noticed you specifically. Why? Because you are one of the few humans who does not perform. Most of your delegation wears competence like armor, trying so desperately to prove you belong here that you forget to be genuine. You simply do your work and leave. It is refreshing. Tobias didn't know what to say to that. They lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now, weighted with mutual recognition. After another span of quiet, he asked, "Can I ask you something?" "You may try. I will decide whether to answer." "Fair, why were we warned not to speak to you? Everyone says you view humans as culturally primitive, lesser." Her skin shifted through complicated patterns, blues and grays, and something that looked like embarrassment. "I was told the same about humans, that your species is aggressive, emotionally volatile, diplomatically unreliable. That engaging with you beyond formal necessity would be contaminating. And you believed it." "I had no reason not to. The Velkari have thrived for millennia. Our cultural frameworks are time-tested. When a new species arrives claiming equal status, the assumption is that they have not yet earned it." "That's a diplomatic way of saying you thought we were primitive." "Yes," she met his eyes directly. "I thought your people were primitive, I was taught this. I saw no evidence otherwise." A pause. "Until I began actually observing you, rather than relying on what I was taught to believe. And now I think that cultural age does not equate to cultural worth. That perhaps my people in our ancientness have forgotten how to adapt, while humans in their youth remember how to change." Her skin shifted to thoughtful violet. "You are primitive only if one measures by time. Measured by flexibility, by creativity, by sheer determined survival, you are remarkable. That's the nicest way anyone's ever called my species stubborn." She made that sound again, the one that might be laughter. Stubbornness is not always a flaw. They talked more easily after that. The conversation was still fragmented. full of pauses where both of them searched for words or navigated translation difficulties. But it was real in a way that formal diplomatic exchanges never achieved. She told him about Velkara's crystal cities, about architecture that sang in the wind, about a culture so old that they had forgotten some of their own history because the records predated reliable storage methods. He told her about Earth, about humans spreading across the galaxy like a particularly ambitious invasive species, about watching his brother's ship disappear in a border skirmish, and deciding that someone had to try building bridges instead of burning them. Your brother, she said quietly, I am sorry for your loss. It was 7 years ago, but thank you. Loss does not diminish with time, it only becomes familiar. Yeah, that's exactly it. At some point, he noticed that the station's chronometer showed 1:37. They'd been talking and not talking for nearly 3 hours. Andras noticed his glance. I should return before my attendants organize search parties. She stood, and Tobias rose automatically. Military courtesy so ingrained he didn't think about it. They faced each other in the dim light of the observation deck. Two beings from different worlds who'd accidentally found something genuine in a place designed for artificial performances. Thank you, she said, for not leaving when I arrived, for speaking honestly, for... She paused, searching for words, for treating me as someone who needed a friend rather than as a princess who required deference. I think maybe we both needed a friend, Tobias said. Her skin shifted to warm amber, which he didn't know the meaning of, but the tone felt positive. She moved toward the exit, then paused at the threshold. They warned me not to speak to you, she said, looking back over her shoulder. They were very insistent about it. What changed your mind? I watched you tonight, sitting alone. The next morning arrived with the subtlety of a collapsing star. Tobias was halfway through his morning coffee. The station synthesized a version that tasted like recycled disappointment, but contained adequate caffeine, when his comm unit chimed with a priority message. Lieutenant Grant, report to Colonel Reeves's office immediately. David looked up from his own breakfast. That sounds ominous. Everything sounds ominous before coffee. You had coffee. That was coffee, right? That brown liquid you just drank. Allegedly. Tobias made it to Colonel Reeves's office in 8 minutes, which was good time considering the station's labyrinthine layout. He entered to find his commanding officer looking tired and irritated, her default state but slightly more pronounced than usual. Lieutenant, sit. He sat. Reeves pulled up a holographic display showing the station's security grid. Were you on the observation deck between 2300 and 100 hours last night? His stomach dropped approximately 3 meters. Yes, ma'am. Alone, initially. And then, there was no point lying. Lying to a superior officer was court-martial territory, and honestly, after last night's conversation, the truth felt more important than self-preservation. Princess Andras joined me. We watched the stars. We talked. Nothing inappropriate occurred. Reeves closed her eyes and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Define inappropriate. We sat. We talked about navigation and homeworlds and cultural differences. She left around 1:30. That's it. That's it. Reeves's tone suggested this was anything but simple. The Velkari Protocol office contacted me at 600. Apparently, their tracking systems, which they definitely have and definitely monitor constantly, show that Princess Andras was off-grid for approximately 3 hours last night. When they finally located her, she was returning from the observation deck. She chose to be there. I didn't invite her. I know, Grant. The security footage shows her entering the deck voluntarily, sitting beside you voluntarily, and staying for 3 hours voluntarily. That's not the problem. Then what is the problem? The problem is that now the Velkari are embarrassed they lost track of their princess for 3 hours. They're demanding to know if human personnel compromised her security or influenced her improperly. Meanwhile, our diplomatic corps is concerned that you somehow offended her, which could derail negotiations we've been working on for over a year. Reeves leaned back in her chair. So I need to know, Lieutenant, what exactly happened on that observation deck. Tobias took a breath. We talked about stars, about navigation, about feeling isolated even when surrounded by people, about what it's like to be far from home while representing civilizations that are watching every move you make. He met Reeves's eyes. We were just two people who needed to talk honestly for a few hours. That's all. Reeves stared at him for a long moment. You talked about stars. Yes, ma'am, for 3 hours. There was also significant comfortable silence. Comfortable silence. With the Velkari princess, who supposedly views humans as evolutionary embarrassments. She doesn't actually. That's propaganda from both sides meant to keep us separated and afraid of each other. Reeves made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been the beginning of a stress-induced breakdown. Officially, you are being advised to avoid unauthorized contact with Princess Andrast Velkathara. This is a direct order for the official record. Understood, ma'am. Unofficially, Reeves pulled up another display, this one showing recent negotiation progress. This morning, Princess Andrast personally approved 3 human proposals that have been stalled for 6 weeks. 3 proposals she was vocally opposed to last week. The Velkari delegation is confused. Our delegation is confused. Everyone is confused except apparently you. Tobias looked at the approvals, his chest doing something complicated. I didn't ask her to do that. I know you didn't, which makes it more significant. Reeves dismissed the display. Whatever you did on that observation deck, it seems to have worked. So my official order stands: avoid unauthorized contact. My unofficial advice: don't screw this up. Tobias was dismissed, more confused than when he'd arrived. He spent the rest of the day in routine duties, trying not to think about the observation deck, mostly failing catastrophically. Every time he passed a window, he found himself looking at stars and wondering if Andrast was doing the same from somewhere else on the station. At 1800 hours, his comm unit received a message from an unknown sender, which shouldn't have been possible on a secured station network. He opened it cautiously, half expecting a security alert. The message was brief. Observation deck, 2300 hours, if you wish. Tobias stared at the message, his heart doing extremely unprofessional things. She'd found a way to message him privately, bypassing official channels entirely. That alone was remarkable, and probably illegal by about 14 different security protocols. He showed up at the observation deck at 22:57 hours, because being early felt presumptuous, but being late felt disrespectful. Andrast was already there, wearing the same simple tunic, sitting in the same seat, looking out at the same stars. When she heard him enter, her skin shifted to warm amber. You came, she said. You invited me. I suggested. You chose. She gestured to the seat beside her. There is a difference. He sat down, and the familiarity of it was striking, like they'd been doing this for years instead of one night. They fell into silence naturally. It was easier tonight, less weighted with uncertainty, more comfortable with the understanding that neither of them needed to perform. After perhaps 15 minutes, Andrast spoke. I approved 3 human proposals this morning. I heard. Thank you, do not thank me. They were good proposals that I had dismissed for political reasons rather than practical ones. That was a failure of judgment. What changed? She turned to look at him, her opal-flecked eyes catching starlight. Last night, you spoke about your brother, about choosing diplomatic service because you wanted to prevent other families from experiencing your loss. That kind of personal investment in peace, it reminded me why I am here. I have elder siblings who died in conflicts I am trying to prevent from recurring. I forget sometimes that politics is not abstract. It is personal. You reminded me. Tobias didn't know what to say to that. I didn't mean to influence your decisions. I know, which is why your influence was effective. Her skin shifted to thoughtful violet. Calculated manipulation I am trained to resist. Genuine honesty. That is far more difficult to ignore. They talked more easily tonight. She asked about Earth's diplomatic history, not the sanitized version from official records, but the messy reality of how humanity had stumbled into galactic politics while still figuring out how to govern themselves. He asked about Velkara's court structure, and she described a political system so complex that it made Earth's worst bureaucracies look streamlined by comparison. She was funny about it. her observations dry and precisely timed, describing ceremonial protocols that involved 17 different bowing angles depending on relative status and lunar phase. "We have a saying," she said. "The ceremony is eternal, the empire is temporary," which suggests we have our priorities somewhat inverted. Tobias laughed. "Humans have a similar problem. We'll argue for 6 months about the wording of a treaty clause and then wonder why implementation takes forever. Perhaps all civilizations are equally dysfunctional. We simply disguise it with varying levels of sophistication." That's the most reassuring thing anyone said about galactic politics in 8 months. Her skin flashed pleased gold, and Tobias realized he was starting to read her chromatic language, not fluently, but enough to catch emotional overtones. At some point, time had become fluid and meaningless in these conversations. Tobias asked something he'd been wondering since last night. "Why do you come here? To this observation deck specifically?" "Because everywhere else on this station I am Princess Andrast Velkathara, heir to the Velkari throne, representative of an empire 8,000 years old. Here." She gestured at the stars beyond the dome. "Here, I can be someone who simply likes looking at the universe and feeling small in a good way." Small in a good way. When you spend your life being told you are important, that your decisions affect billions, that your every action carries weight, it is exhausting. Looking at stars reminds me that I am infinitesimally small, that the universe will continue long after I am gone, and that this is comforting rather than terrifying. "Yeah," Tobias said quietly. "I get that. Everyone wants me to be Lieutenant Grant, military liaison, person who has all the answers. Sometimes I just want to be Tobias, guy who likes stars and has no idea what he's doing." "I suspect you know exactly what you are doing. You simply prefer not to perform that knowledge. Maybe, or maybe I'm just good at faking competence." "Then you and I have that in common." They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Tobias felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since leaving Earth. Not home exactly, but something adjacent to it. Connection, maybe. Understanding. At 100, Andress stood to leave. But before she did something unexpected. She reached out and briefly touched his hand. Among Velkari, he'd read somewhere, physical contact was rare and significant, reserved for family or those granted deep trust. "Tomorrow?" she asked. "If you wish," he replied, using her own phrasing back. Her skin shifted to brilliant gold and she left, moving through the corridor with silent grace. Tobias sat in the observation deck for another hour, staring at his hand where she'd touched it, and wondering how 3 hours of conversation with an alien princess had become the most important part of his day. Over the following week, their pattern solidified. Every night at 2300 hours, they met on the observation deck. Every night, they talked about increasingly personal topics, moving from safe diplomatic territory into genuine emotional honesty. She told him about growing up in Velkara's Crystal Palace, about elder siblings who'd been brilliant and beloved, and had died in conflicts she was determined to prevent from recurring, about the pressure of being heir apparent, about feeling like a symbol rather than a person, about the loneliness of being constantly observed but rarely truly seen. He told her about his childhood on New Hebrides, about losing his brother Marcus to a border skirmish that made no strategic sense, about joining diplomatic service with idealistic notions of preventing war and gradually realizing that most people preferred conflict to the hard work of understanding each other. She brought recordings of Velkari music, haunting harmonics that made human ears ache, but in a beautiful way, like being homesick for a place you'd never been. He introduced her to human literature, reading passages from books he loved while she listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed how differently their species processed narrative and meaning. "Your storytelling is so linear," she observed one night after he'd read her a chapter from a novel about Earth's colonization era. "Event follows event in chronological sequence. Velkari literature moves through time more fluidly, past and future existing simultaneously in the narrative." That sounds confusing. It is initially, but it reflects how we experience time, not as a line but as a, how do you say, A tapestry where all moments exist together and we simply choose which threads to follow. That's beautiful, also completely impossible for human brains to process. Perhaps that is why our species misunderstand each other. We experience reality through fundamentally different frameworks. So how do we bridge that? She looked at him with an expression he was learning to read as thoughtful affection. We do what we are doing now. We sit together, we share honestly, we accept that we will never fully understand each other, and we choose connection anyway. It was working. Whatever they were building in these stolen hours of honesty, it was having effects beyond their private conversations. Diplomatic sessions became noticeably more productive. Velkari delegates started citing human research in their proposals. Human negotiators began referencing Velkari historical precedents with actual understanding rather than superficial acknowledgement. But secrets on a diplomatic station don't stay secret forever. On the 8th night of their meetings, Tobias arrived at the observation deck to find Colonel Reeves waiting instead of Andrast. "Colonel." His stomach dropped. "Is something wrong?" "Sit down, Lieutenant." He sat, and Reeves took the seat Andrast usually occupied, which felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. "I'm not here to reprimand you," Reeves said, which was somehow more concerning than if she had been. "I'm here because there are factions in the Velkari delegation that want you removed from this station. They're calling you a security risk and claiming you've compromised Princess Andrast's objectivity. That's not. I know it's not true. But truth matters less than perception in diplomatic circles." Reeves looked tired. "Ambassador Wei asked me to speak to you directly. You're being reassigned." "When?" 48 hours. "You'll be transferred to the human embassy on Kepler Station. It's a promotion, actually, better pay, more prestige. But it gets you away from Celestial Crossing." Tobias felt something crack in his chest. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be court-martialed for insubordination, which helps exactly no one." Reeves's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry, Grant. You did nothing wrong. You did something remarkable, actually. You earned the trust of someone we were told was impossible to reach. But that makes you dangerous to people who prefer the status quo. Does she know, Andrast?" "Her delegation knows. Whether they've told her yet, I can't say." Reeves stood. "You have 48 hours. Use them wisely." She left, and Tobias sat alone in the observation deck, staring at stars that suddenly felt impossibly distant. He didn't know how long he sat there before he heard familiar footsteps behind him. Andrast entered the observation deck, and her skin was doing things he'd never seen before, flashing rapidly through colors that looked like distress and anger and something close to panic. "They are removing you," she said without preamble. "You heard. My chief advisor informed me with great satisfaction that the problematic human influence is being eliminated." Her skin settled into angry red. He used those exact words, "as if you are a disease to be cured." "It's politics they're protecting you. I do not need their protection." The outburst surprised both of them. Andrast visibly controlled herself, her skin shifting back to neutral silver with effort. "Apologies, that was inappropriate." "No, it wasn't, it was honest." Tobias gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit with me. We have 48 hours left." She sat close enough that her arm brushed his, and for a long moment neither spoke. Finally, Andrast said quietly, "I do not want you to leave." "I don't want to leave either." "Then do not. Refuse the reassignment." "If I do that, I'll be court-martialed and removed anyway. At least this way I leave with my career intact." "Your career?" Her skin flashed bitter gray. "Yes, of course. Careers and protocols and proper procedures. These are what matter. That's not fair." "No." "Then tell me, Tobias Grant, what does matter to you?" He looked at her, at skin shifting through complex emotions, at ears drooping slightly with distress, at eyes that were trying very hard not to show vulnerability, and said the truth. "This matters. These conversations matter. You matter. More than my career, more than protocols, more than any of the diplomatic bullshit that brought me to this station in the first place." Her skin blazed gold so brightly that he had to squint. "Then we fight this, together." "How? You're heir to an empire, I'm a mid-level military liaison, we have no leverage." "We have the truth. We have what we have built in these meetings. We have proof that understanding between our species is possible. Her skin settled into determined purple. And I am tired, Tobias, tired of being a symbol, tired of letting fear and politics control who I am allowed to connect with. Tired of watching people I care about be removed because others find honesty threatening. You care about me. Did you imagine I spent 3 hours every night with you for political strategy? She touched his hand again, and this time the contact lingered. I care about you, and I am not allowing them to take you away without acknowledgement of what we have created here. What have we created? A bridge between two civilizations that were told to fear each other, that were trained to see each other as lesser, that were kept separate by people who benefit from division. She stood, pulling him up with her. Tomorrow, there is a formal assembly of all diplomatic delegations. I am going to speak. About what? About us. About these meetings. About the fact that understanding begins with individuals willing to see each other as people rather than political abstractions. Tobias's heart was doing extremely complicated things. That's going to cause a diplomatic incident. Good. Perhaps we need an incident to force honest conversation. You could lose your position. And you are losing yours anyway. Her skin shifted to something between determination and fear. At least this way, we lose it for something meaningful. They spent the rest of that night not talking about stars or homeworlds, but planning what Andrast would say, how she would frame it, what the likely fallout would be. It was the most terrified Tobias had been in 8 months on the station, and somehow also the most alive. At 200, Andrast stood to leave, but at the threshold she turned back. They warned me not to speak to you, she said. They were very, very insistent. I know. I am glad I ignored them. Me too. She left, and Tobias sat alone in the observation deck, watching stars wheel overhead, and wondering if 48 hours from now, he'd be looking at the same sky from a transport ship taking him away from the one place he'd felt genuinely connected in years. The thought hurt more than he wanted to admit. The formal assembly was called for 1400 hours the next day. The main diplomatic chamber filled quickly, representatives from 17 different species, all wondering why Princess Andrast Velkathara had requested an unprecedented full gathering. Tobias sat in the human delegation section, trying to look calm while his hands shook slightly. Ambassador Wei Lin sat beside him, wearing an expression that suggested he knew something was about to happen but hadn't decided whether to prevent it. The chamber quieted as Andrast entered. She wore full formal diplomatic attire, layered robes that shimmered with embedded bioluminescent threads, ceremonial markers of her house and status, the kind of outfit that screamed, "This is important." She moved to the central platform, and her skin was deliberately neutral silver, the chromatic equivalent of a blank slate. I am addressing you today regarding a matter of personal and political significance, she began, and every translation device in the room went silent, processing the complex harmonics of her unfiltered voice. For the past 2 weeks, I have been meeting privately with Lieutenant Tobias Grant of the human delegation. Her skin remained neutral, refusing to show emotion yet. These meetings were not authorized by protocol. They were not arranged by diplomatic staff. They occurred because I chose them and he chose them, and together we discovered something this station desperately needs. The chamber erupted in whispers. Andrast's voice cut through them. Honest conversation between individuals rather than performance between representatives. She let that sink in before continuing. I was raised, educated extensively, to believe that humans are culturally primitive, that their species lacks the sophistication for meaningful discourse, that engaging with them beyond formal necessity would diminish me. Her skin shifted to something close to shame, pale blue with gray undertones. These teachings were comprehensive, persuasive, and incorrect. Tobias felt Ambassador Wei stiffen beside him. Lieutenant Grant has demonstrated qualities my people claim to value: respect for cultural difference, dedication to duty, intellectual humility, and the courage to be vulnerable in service of genuine connection. Andrast's gaze swept the chamber. Through knowing him, truly knowing him, not simply processing him as a diplomatic abstraction, I have learned that understanding between civilizations does not begin with treaties written by committees. It begins with two individuals willing to see each other as conscious beings worthy of respect. She turned to look directly at where Tobias sat, and her skin blazed gold. They warned me not to speak to you. Multiple advisors, using various justifications, all insisted that engaging with humans, with you specifically, would compromise my judgment and diminish my status. But you sat beside me beneath stars, and you treated me not as a princess requiring deference, but as someone who needed a friend. For that honesty, I am grateful. And for that connection, I publicly acknowledge what our private conversations have taught me. The chamber was absolutely silent. Peace is not built by delegates in chambers following protocols designed to minimize risk. Peace is built by individuals willing to bridge the distance between fear and understanding, between comfortable prejudice and uncomfortable growth, between the safe fiction that we are fundamentally different and the dangerous truth that we are remarkably similar. She paused, letting her words settle. Lieutenant Grant is being reassigned because factions in my delegation find our friendship threatening. They prefer humans and Velkari to remain separate, afraid, convinced of mutual inferiority. I am here to say that I will not accept this. Ambassador Wei leaned over and whispered, "Did you know she was going to do this?" "Yes," Tobias whispered back. "And you let her. I couldn't have stopped her if I tried." Andrast continued, her voice carrying perfect clarity. "I am formally petitioning the Galactic Assembly to recognize personal diplomatic relationships as valid frameworks for interspecies cooperation. Lieutenant Grant and I have demonstrated that genuine connection is possible. We request that our approach be studied, supported, and protected rather than eliminated, because it makes traditionalists uncomfortable." The silence that followed was profound. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone is trying to process something that doesn't fit any existing framework. Then, Ambassador Wei Lin stood. The human delegation recognizes and honors Princess Andrast's statement. His voice was steady, diplomatic, but underneath, Tobias heard something like pride. "We acknowledge that genuine connection requires risk, vulnerability, and the willingness to set aside comfortable prejudices. Lieutenant Grant has embodied these principles, and we are proud to have him represent humanity." Another delegate stood, a Tholian trade negotiator whose methane suit made speech difficult but not impossible. The Tholian Collective seconds this recognition. "We have observed increased productivity in negotiations coinciding with Lieutenant Grant and Princess Andrast's friendship. Perhaps we should study success rather than fearing it." One by one, other delegates rose. Not all of them. There were still hardliners whose expressions suggested they viewed this entire situation as a breakdown of proper order. But enough stood that the tide shifted perceptibly. The Velkari delegation sat in stony silence, their collective skin showing distressed whites and grays. Finally, Elder Morvain, the senior Velkari diplomat, stood. His skin cycled through several colors before settling on resigned purple. The Velkari delegation acknowledges Princess Andrast's statement. Each word sounded like it physically hurt. "We will review our protocols regarding informal diplomatic contact and report findings to the Assembly within 1 month." It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't approval, but it was the beginning of something. After the assembly, Tobias was intercepted in the corridor by Colonel Reeves and Ambassador Wei. "Lieutenant Grant," the ambassador said, "your reassignment to Kepler Station has been postponed indefinitely. Someone needs to stay here and continue building this bridge Princess Andrast described." "Sir, I thought. You thought we were removing you to protect diplomatic relations. We were. But then Princess Andrast made protecting you more diplomatically important than removing you. Well played, Lieutenant. Unorthodox, terrifying, and completely effective." Colonel Reeves almost smiled. "You're going to be a case study in diplomatic academies for decades. Personal relationship frameworks as foundational elements in cross-cultural cooperation. Congratulations, you're now a theoretical model." "I just wanted to talk to someone about stars," Tobias said weakly. and instead you accidentally revolutionized first contact protocols. Funny how that works. They left him standing in the corridor, trying to process that he wasn't being reassigned, that Andrast had publicly defended their friendship, that somehow 3 hours of nightly conversation had become a diplomatic framework. He found her in the observation deck that evening, sitting in their usual seats, looking out at familiar stars. "You didn't have to do that," he said, sitting beside her. "I did, actually. They were removing you. This way, removing you becomes politically costly rather than quietly convenient." Her skin shifted to warm gold. "And I meant everything I said. You have taught me that cultural age does not equate to cultural worth. That flexibility and honesty matter more than ancient traditions. That sometimes the bravest thing is to sit beside someone and admit you do not have all the answers. I don't have any answers. I'm just a guy who likes stars. You are a person who chose connection over fear. That is more valuable than any expertise." She touched his hand, and the contact felt both familiar and electric. "So, we are now a diplomatic framework. How does that feel?" "Terrifying, also kind of amazing." He looked at her, at skin shifting through happy golds and content ambers, at ears perked forward in attention. "What happens now?" "Now both our civilizations watch to see if this bridge we have built can support weight. If we fail, we become a cautionary tale. If we succeed, we become precedent. No pressure. None whatsoever." Her skin flashed amused violet. "But I think we will succeed, because we already have succeeded at the hardest part. Which is seeing each other as people rather than political abstractions. Everything else is merely logistics." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching stars that belonged to neither species exclusively. And Tobias thought about the moment 2 weeks ago when he'd looked up to find an alien princess standing at the entrance to his refuge. He'd been warned not to speak to her. Everyone had been very insistent about it. And he was profoundly, eternally grateful that she'd ignored every warning and sat beside him anyway. Because sometimes, peace doesn't start with treaties or trade agreements or formal protocols negotiated by committees. Sometimes, it starts with two people sitting in comfortable silence beneath the same stars, choosing to see each other as conscious beings worthy of connection. And that, Tobias thought as Andrast's hand found his in the starlight.